I was recently watching YouTube channel Kevinnottradicath. He was responding to the claim that Luther's anti-Semitism and immorality is an issue for Lutheranism. For most Catholics, this is an issue because they believe that the origins of the or a church are important. As a Catholic, I believe my church was founded by Jesus Christ himself, and it's essential for the Christian that he or she is part of a church that is founded not just by somebody who is good and morally upstanding, but by Christ himself. And this is why we bring up other denominations and their foundations, like Anglicanism, which wasn't founded by Jesus Christ, but actually by the King of England, and not for any good or holy reason, but because the Pope wouldn't grant him an annulment. Basically, the Pope said, no, you can't have a divorce, your marriage is valid. And boom, you have Anglicanism. I don't think that this is a really good argument personally. I think it's rhetorically strong, but doesn't hold up. The fact that the Lutheran Church is not a full or real church doesn't have much to do with the morality of Luther, but its break from apostolic succession. After all, Peter had some shameful moments in the Gospels, but he's the first bishop of Rome. So if we use the argument Catholics use against Luther just about Peter, where does that leave us? To be clear, I don't think that Peter's church in Rome was invalid, and I do think Luther's church is invalid, but it doesn't have to do with the morality of the individual. I'm not particularly concerned about Luther's alleged immorality. He did worse things than say anti-Semitic stuff, even though that's bad enough. I don't think that's what would invalidate Lutheranism. I'm more concerned with what Kevin says about Catholicism and alleged anti-Semitic content in ecumenical councils. Unlike Luther's relationship with anti-Semitism, I do think that anti-Semitic content in infallible canons would work to invalidate Catholicism. After all, ecumenical councils contain infallible statements on faith and morals. It's not just incorrect theology that would be problematic for an infallible ecumenical declaration, but immorality would also be problematic. Now, before I continue, I do feel it's necessary in today's social and political climate to reassure you, I am not an anti-Semite. If you are a Catholic, you should not be an anti-Semite. I spent most of my life as a Baptist dispensationalist and thus a Zionist. I'm not a Zionist anymore as a Catholic, but because of my upbringing, I actually have a positive bias towards the Jews. I also think that it's important to say that I recognize that there are and have been Catholics who have been anti-Semitic. I am not aware of any of the saints who struggled with the sin, but that's just my ignorance. I haven't studied the life of every saint and arrived at that conclusion. Further, if a saint did or said something that was truly anti-Semitic, I would feel comfortable condemning those actions and words. Before we continue, I want to establish what anti-Semitism is. According to Merriam-Webster, it is hostility towards or discrimination against Jews as a religious, ethnic, or racial group. I take a little bit of an issue with this definition. Merriam-Webster also defines Semite as a member of any of a number of peoples of ancient southwestern Asia, including the Akkadians, Phoenicians, Hebrews, and Arabs. So it seems to me that the definition of anti-Semite is affected by the modern social and political climate. And for good reason. I recognize that words evolve, and that's fine. However, if we are going to apply a consistent standard to the definition of anti-Semite using the definition of Semite, then being prejudiced against the Islamic religion is also anti-Semitic, since Arabs are Semites according to Merriam-Webster's dictionary. All this to say that I think the pertinent definition of anti-Semite for our purposes today would be hostility towards ethnically Semitic people or peoples. Now, you could just accuse me of editing the definition so I can walk out of this video reassuring myself and you guys that the Catholic Church is not anti-Semitic. But if we're going to use the broad definition that Merriam-Webster gives us, me and the Catholic Church are both extremely anti-Semitic, and neither of us are planning on making changes anytime soon. The reason, though, that I am using a minimalistic and what I think is a more accurate definition is because the definition I'm using has moral implications. Hinduism comes from the Indus Valley, what we call India today. It used to be called Hindustan, Hinduism. And as a Catholic, I'm hostile towards Hinduism. And then I believe it's not true. Because of the exclusive claims of Catholicism, this is what I believe about all other religions. However, this doesn't mean that I'm anti-Indian or racist against Indians. There's no real racial implications of me rejecting Hinduism as not true, because I don't believe the factual claims of Hinduism. This is pertinent because if we're asking the question if there's any racist ideology embedded in the canons of ecumenical councils, so maybe we should ask if there exists any anti-Semitism of a species with moral implications. Now, without further delay, let's watch Kevin's first example of anti-Semitism in a Catholic canon.
If you think that Luther wrote down some things that today we would find unsavory, wait until you hear about the things that canonized Catholic saints and infallible church councils have said. Canon 67 makes it clear that Jews still have to pay the Catholic Church because really, Jews are just taking Christian money anyway. Jews shall be compelled to make satisfaction to churches for tithes and offerings due to the churches, which the churches were accustomed to receive from Christians for houses and other possessions, before they passed by whatever title to the Jews, so that the churches may thus be preserved from loss.
Now, of course, I paused the video when I first watched it to read the entirety of the canon. Kevin has the last bit highlighted as if that's the pertinent part of the canon. I think probably for his purposes, it seems to be the pertinent part. However, if you want to understand the canon, the entirety of that canon, the entirety of the canon is the pertinent part. So if you were to read the whole paragraph, this relates to the abuse of interest on loans, also known as usury. Christian Europe in the medieval period was very concerned with the issue, even though it seemed like theologians were relatively split on what constitutes usury. Because the issue of usury was highlighted by the church, the Jews did not share this concern as deeply. The Jewish moneylenders became relatively infamous for charging unfair interest rates on loans, and saying that probably won't earn me any brownie points in the I'm not an anti-Semite category, but this just does seem to be the case, so I'm going to say it anyways.
I'm not going to say what race, what people. It was a Jewish.
The issue of usury caused what many people simply refer to as the expulsions in the medieval period. It seems many Jews were ousted from the community as a retribution for violating the moral and civil laws on usury. According to an article on stanford.edu from the Human Science Department, expulsions are often painted as an attack on Jewish communities, but somehow they managed to overlook the expulsion of many Christian moneylenders for the same reason. Apparently, Christian moneylenders that migrated from outside of Europe were often expelled because of their immoral lending practices. I don't want to be uncharitable towards Kevin, but it sounds to me like he's kind of painting Canon 67 of the Fourth Lateran Council as a sort of Christian iteration of the Islamic jizya. However, the canon seems to effectively communicate that the reparations paid to the churches were imposed because of usury, not because they were racist against Jews. And this makes the issue, of course, much less racist and more like a judicial act aimed at a community that had a reputation for violating not just the moral, but civil law on usury. Now, you as the individual can still say, hey, I think this is bad business, no pun intended. What you should know is that Canon 67 through 70 are not infallible. Only ecumenical and papal statements that say we define, we declare, and we decree are considered infallible, and they also must be speaking on matters of faith and morals. If you're a Protestant, that might confuse you. You've likely been told that Catholics think the church is infallible, and people who have told you that have just kind of left it at that. The actual Catholic teaching is much more nuanced. So this judicial ruling wouldn't even be in the category of what could be considered infallible. I made sure this was correct with a Catholic canon lawyer. You can also find this info online pretty easily, but I wanted to double check.
Canon 68 might sound familiar to anyone who knows anything about 1930s Germany. A difference of dress distinguishes Jews or Saracens from Christians in some provinces, but in others a certain confusion has developed so that they are indistinguishable. Whence it sometimes happens that, by mistake, Christians join with Jewish or Saracen women, and Jews or Saracens with Christian women. In order that the offense of such a damnable mixing may not spread further, under the excuse of a mistake of this kind, we decree that such persons of either sex, in every Christian province and at all times, are to be distinguished in public from other people by the character of their dress, seeing moreover that this was enjoined upon them by Moses himself, as we read. They shall not appear in public at all on the days of lamentation and on Passion Sunday, because some of them on such days, as we have heard, do not blush to parade in very ornate dress and are not afraid to mock the Christians who are presenting a memorial of the most sacred passion and are displaying signs of grief. So, it's illegal to not be sad about Jesus dying if you live in a Christian country. That's what Canon 68 was saying.
Oh man, this one does seem bad, especially from the surface. However, there's some historical context that is pertinent, and it might not justify it for you completely. However, it takes it out of the realm of racism, I think. The Catholic Church has always held its claim of exclusivity closely, so the idea of coexisting with other religions doesn't really sit well. And if you are a true believer in Christ, it shouldn't sit well with you either. Even I am invested in the supremacy of Christianity over all other religions. Not that it's a scale. Islam and Judaism are just false, and Christianity is true. Christianity isn't like edging out other religions in the race. The other religions just aren't a part of the race. So it is worth going after other religions to Christianize them, even if they are relatively small in comparison to Catholicism or the larger demographic of the nation. Now, I will say that because the council was ecumenical and Canon 68 is in fact a canon, it requires obedience. However, demonstrating that there were some less than ethical rulings regarding how principles were brought out into effect, it doesn't really show that there is something immoral in what's considered infallible in the councils of the Catholic Church. It really just doesn't do the work that maybe Kevin wants it to do. Not that I don't sympathize with the sentiment that he's communicating. I'll extend an olive branch, of course, to the skeptics, including Kevin, to say that you're right for reading this and thinking, oh, that's rough. But I'll still push back that this wasn't racial, but religious. In fact, saying that the Catholic Church is racist against Jews is actually a really hard case to make. Sure, there are less than moral Catholic individuals that insisted that they murdered our Lord and did and said anti-Semitic things. However, the Catholic Church recognizes that most of the early church saints were Jews. They venerate all of the apostles who were all Jews. In the end, a balanced take is needed for Canon 68. We should recognize that they were the religious authorities at the time, and the canon is in a way authoritative, but we should just remember that it's not infallible.
Canon 69 says that Jews can't hold positions of government. It would be too absurd for a blasphemer of Christ to exercise power over Christians. We therefore renew in this canon, on account of the boldness of the offenders, what the Council of Toledo provincially decreed on this matter. We forbid Jews to be appointed to public offices, since, under cover of them, they are very hostile to Christians. Any official so appointed shall be denied commerce with Christians in business and in other matters until he has converted to the use of poor Christians in accordance with the directions of the diocesan bishop, whatever he has obtained from Christians by reason of his office so acquired, and he shall surrender with shame the office which he irreverently assumed. We extend the same thing to the pagans. So pagans aren't off the hook here. Both Jews and pagans, if they were to assume any kind of government office, that would be irreverently assuming it. And so they have to shamefully surrender that office.
This is actually the canon out of the three we have discussed thus far that I have the least of an issue with. While this again is not an infallible declaration from the council, it's still a good canon. There are two things that immediately stand out to me that tell me this isn't a racial issue but rather religious. Firstly, the canon is based on the Jews being blasphemers. Obviously, the church isn't saying that a Jew by racial nature blasphemes Christ, as if a Jew exits the womb using God's name in vain. That would be weird and a ridiculous notion, considering again that most of the early church and her saints were Jewish. Secondly, its inclusion of the pagans towards the end. The issue is then clear that it's not about Jews, it's about people from other religions, not even other ethnicities, just other religions. If the canon was about the Jews racially, then it would be weird to include pagans in the conversation. I have no problem with any of this because Europe was a Christian-dominant continent, and not just a little bit, but most everybody was Catholic. This is a little bit like a Muslim-dominated country from the Middle East wanting to ensure that the leader of that country was Muslim. I think Islam is false, and I think they should all be Christian, but in human reasoning, that just makes a whole lot of sense. I also think this is like the United States requiring the president to be a citizen of that country. It just makes rational sense. Now, even in a country that is not a Christian-dominant country, I think we should still want a Christian leader. And I would hope that we would think it's better than having a Jewish or Muslim or atheistic leader. After all, if Christianity were true, it makes the most sense to try and make sure the leader of your country is Christian. So I'm not 100% sure what the beef is, what Kevin's beef is here. I think that this kind of comes off a little bit, if I can oversimplify it, as him being upset that Catholics actually believed what Catholics actually believed to the fullest extent.
And remember that the Fourth Lateran Council is the 12th ecumenical council, and as such is considered infallible on matters of faith and morals. Of course, most Catholics today would tell you that these canons of what to do with Jews living in Christian countries, those are not infallible. And since the Catholic Church has conveniently never actually made a list of what's infallible and what's not, I can't really say anything else about this.
This is the last clip that I'm going to show. This is just him calling the church out for the solution to some issues being convenient. Convenience isn't a bad thing when it comes to solutions to problems. If a fire breaks out at work, it's real convenient that you've got a fire extinguisher in arm's reach, but that doesn't mean that it's not the solution to the problem. Whether something is convenient or not convenient should not actually be involved in the conversation for whether the solution is a legitimate or true solution or not. After all, if a philosophical or theological solution is not convenient, a lot of people will just claim that it's word gymnastics. The truth is that people will find a way to be grumpy about the solutions to problems that they want the church to have. And I don't know Kevin's heart or attitude on this, so that statement is just a generalization about anti-apologists. But I'll also say that this is true with apologists. If something is convenient for answering an alleged problem with the faith, they may romantically speak about the solutions to our problems being hidden in plain sight. And if a solution is not convenient, they may start to consider themselves to be a serious thinker. Either way, it doesn't really have any bearing on what is objectively true or whether a solution is valid or not. Now, he is correct that the Catholic Church has never infallibly defined what constitutes an infallible statement. However, the record has been pretty clear and consistent that infallible statements are only on faith and morals. The canons he brought up are not on faith and morals. So the objection that the church has been vague in some way about what the definition of infallible canon is, it doesn't seem particularly relevant. And just to cap off the episode, because I don't want to make it sound like I'm running from other problems, I just think the other stuff that he mentions, sometimes valid, sometimes not, they're not really pertinent to whether Catholicism is true or not. He brings up words from John Chrysostom. I don't think that they're a problem, and I don't think they paint him as anti-Semitic. But even in the worst case scenario, if they did, he's just a single guy. He doesn't speak for the entirety of the church. And so that wouldn't be an issue even if he was an anti-Semite. And the Albigensian Crusade, I'm not going to run from that as well. The Crusade was pretty bad. Him bringing that up is justified. And I don't think it actually discredits the church. But the Crusade was very, very bad. And of course, I think in Christian-dominated Europe, there is every reason to Christianize cults, to expose them as cults, and to disband heretical communities. I'm all for that. However, there were moments of the Albigensian Crusade that are absolutely not acceptable or defensible in any way. The massacre of Béziers is one such example of an insane crime against humanity. I think that a Catholic priest or something led a charge against the town of Béziers. There were like a couple hundred Albigensians there, and the town liked them and didn't want to give them up to the authorities. And the priest basically said, kill them all. God will sort out his own. And they massacred something like 20,000 people. Now, like, the Big C Catholic Church didn't tell that priest to do that. That's not what happened. That priest is downright evil for doing that, but this isn't something that the Catholic Church corporately did. But yeah, of course, the massacre at Béziers and the Albigensian Crusade was not carried out in a good way at all. And of course, it's a black mark in Catholic history. But it doesn't really have anything to do with whether the infallible magisterium has remained moral or consistent. Anyways, guys, these are just my thoughts, and I hope you have a wonderful day. God bless.